Hello and welcome along. So today we're going to put to bed one of the most asked questions in the 40k universe. Did Guilliman really kill Omegon at the Battle of Escador? So this event was supposed to have taken place during the Great Scouring. Now, the Great Scouring is the Imperial response to the end of the Heresy. It's an attempt to drive the traitors out of all of the territory that they gained during the Horus Heresy. So it's an attempt to essentially rebuild the Imperium after the terrible events leading up to the Siege of Terra, where huge numbers of Imperial worlds were destroyed, conquered, laid to waste, essentially. And the leaders of the Imperium, after the Heresy, realized that they can't just sit and wait for the traitors to come back. They have to pursue them out into the galaxy, reconquer these worlds as they go, and try and destroy as many of the traitors as they can get their hands on. Now, the way that the traitor legions responded to the end of the Heresy, to the defeat at the Siege of Terra, is not all the same. Some legions famously retreated into the Eye of Terror. That's where they went to brood for 10,000 years and launched various raids back into the Imperium from time to time. Obviously, famously, Abaddon took the remnants of the Lunar Wolves and various other warbands, creating the Black Legion from their remnants. However, other legions didn't retreat into the Eye of Terror, so the Alpha Legion being one of them. Now, instead of retreating into the Eye of Terror, they essentially launched a new campaign, moved their operations to the Galactic East around the area of Ultramar. Not so much attacking Ultramar, but in the vicinity of Ultramar. And this in itself can be seen as a direct provocation to Guilliman. And other people have suggested that essentially this was Omegon, who was at that time believed to be the sole Primarch of the Alpha Legion, after Alpharis' supposed death at the hands of Dawn. You should watch my other video on that if you are unaware of these events. It is believed Omegon wanted to provoke Guilliman into some kind of conflict to give him a chance to show his superiority over Guilliman, who was lauded as one of the best strategists of the Imperium, and certainly of the Loyalists. And so he deliberately took the Alpha Legion to an area where Guilliman couldn't ignore him, where during the Scouring, he would face Guilliman's Ultramarines, and Guilliman would be leading them. And this is the circumstances under which the battle at Escador happens. Now, very little is known about the events of this battle, other than the Ultramarines under Guilliman's leadership used relatively unconventional tactics, which slightly caught the Alpha Legion unawares and allowed them to launch a surprise attack on the Alpha Legion's headquarters. But the Alpha Legion responded to this very well and managed to counterattack and largely defeat this force. Only after Guilliman was able to engage in single combat their leader, who was seemingly Alpharius, but obviously is believed to be Omegon, because Alpharius is believed to have died, as we said before, at the hands of Dawn at the Battle of Pluto. So it's assumed this is Omegon, and therefore Guilliman kills him in single combat, thinking he's killed Alpharius, but actually having killed Omegon. That's the general gist of it. Then the Ultramarines have to escape because they're being defeated, and they take very heavy casualties doing so, and ultimately the Alpha Legion proves its superiority over the Ultramarines in warfare, but Alpharius / Omegon is dead, and Guilliman gets his Primarch kill, which is a very old piece of lore and has been long-standing and has, to be honest, played a big part in raising Guilliman's reputation in single combat above what it probably should be. So there we are. That's how we got to this point. So all this leads us to the question, was this really Omegon? Famously, those claiming to be Alpharius rarely are Alpharius. And, in this case, the idea is it's someone claiming to be Alpharius who's not Alpharius, but is in fact Omegon. And so, yes, he kills Omegon. But the problem is, Alpharius and Omegon are pretty hard to distinguish between. I mean, ultimately, if he did kill Omegon, it's effectively the same as killing Alpharius. So we need to ask ourselves, could Guilliman kill Alpharius? And could he kill him in the way that is described? And if he didn't, then what really happened? What I'd like to say is, we know that Alpharius fought Dawn. And then from that description of that fight, we get a good idea of Alpharius and therefore Omegon's combat capabilities. The problem is, saying we know anything regarding the Alpha Legion is pretty hard. So, do we actually know that Alpharius fought Dawn? Well, no, we can't be 100% certain. But let's say we assume that he did, and that the description of that fight is a fair description of Alpharius fighting another Primarch, and therefore what we would expect from Omegon as well, because they are practically indistinguishable in their capabilities. So when Guilliman fights this Alpharius Omegon character, he beats him incredibly easily. It's long existed in the lore, this description of the fight, and he effectively kills him like he's nothing. He kills him with one strike. It's very easy, and it gives the impression of Guilliman being far superior to the person he kills. Now, this has led to two things. Firstly, it's led to the idea that Alpharius and Omegon weren't very good at fighting compared to the other Primarchs. This has been obviously largely dispelled by the actual Horus Heresy books, which has filled out their characters a lot more and given them a lot more credibility when it comes to combat. You've got to remember that when this particular piece of lore was created, the ideas about the Primarchs and their different abilities, different characters, wasn't as well filled out. It may have been in the minds of the people writing this initial piece of lore about how Alpharius / Omegon died, didn't have quite the same idea about their character as the writers of the Horus Heresy would have when they would eventually get to filling out the characters much more. Now, the Horus Heresy books do take precedent over all previous lore, so you can't really say just because this old piece of lore exists, therefore it has to remain unchanged forever. The Horus Heresy books changed a lot of the way we see many of the characters in the 40k universe, or the background lore of the 40k universe, so 30k. Many of the Primarchs come out of the Horus Heresy books looking very different to what they looked like going into them. And this is just one of those pieces of lore where you have to accept that if you thought, oh, well, Alpharius and Omegon just aren't very good at fighting, and that's why Guilliman beats them, because he's twice their size and it's easy, then that's just wrong. That's what we thought at the time, but it is wrong. It's very clear from the Horus Heresy books that Alpharius and Omegon are very skilled individual fighters and are quite capable of fighting the other Primarchs on a relatively equal footing, even though they are significantly smaller than the other Primarchs. So if we take that position, this person, if they are really Omegon, should be very good at fighting and very capable of going toe-to-toe with Guilliman or any other Primarch. Would they have lost this fight so easily? Well, no, is the short answer. They shouldn't have lost this fight with one strike. Now, of course, the other issue is this description of the fight doesn't have to be accurate. It's the 40k universe. This is a piece of mythology, essentially, that is describing something that supposedly happened 10,000 years before. In many ways, it is just mythology. It's not necessarily an historical description of the events as witnessed by the Ultramarines that were there. If we imagine how this story could reach the current 40k universe, it's something that probably starts off as a battle report. These are the events that happened from some Astartes who were there, and then it gets changed by Imperial Propaganda over time, building the mythology around Guilliman himself, one of the most heroic characters left within the Imperium, who eventually is obviously killed and goes into stasis, but is still physically there in this stasis chamber where he can be seen and worshipped by the general population of the Imperium. His mythology is going to grow and grow and grow. And so this idea that he could strike down this traitor Primarch with one blow becomes a story that you would imagine these people would tell each other. But that doesn't mean that that's what's supposed to have happened. You could take that another step further and say the fight itself doesn't need to have happened. It may never have happened. And it might simply be a way of describing some good that came out of a terrible disaster that the Ultramarines suffered during the Scouring. Now, let's say the Ultramarines fought the Alpha Legion in the Great Scouring. They got their asses handed to them. They were embarrassed. They lost a large number of casualties. That has to be explained away in some way. And one of the ways of doing that is by saying, but we did kill their Primarch. We killed Alpharius. Guilliman fought him in single combat and bravely struck him down with a single blow because he's so superior. And then people forget about the terrible military disaster that happened. This is something that people have done throughout history when they distort reports of events, just trying to create some positive spin on an event. Then when you consider that in an organization as prone to distorting the truth as the Imperium, and you're talking about an event that happened 10,000 years ago, this is very clearly a likely explanation for the events. The event was probably so bad that they couldn't just pretend that it didn't happen, so they just had to give a positive spin on the event. Now, of course, it could be that Guilliman did kill someone claiming to be Alpharius. It was simply another Alpha Legionary, and that's why he killed him so easily. It is not clear that the Ultramarines strongly believe that this was Alpharius. They may well themselves be relatively open to the idea that this was in fact an imposter. But either way, whether it's mythology, PR, spin that's got out of hand over 10,000 years, or it was an accurate description of what happened, and that Guilliman did just simply strike down this Alpharius character very easily, both of those would imply that it's not Omegon. Now, another way we need to look at this is from an out-of-universe angle. So we have to accept that this was created a long time ago, as I said, before the writers really had a feel for the characters, and it was just a snippet of what happened in the previous 10,000 years to give some idea of the background. They hadn't really fully developed the characters, they hadn't thought about the full stories, and all of that really came about during writing the Horus Heresy books. And in fact, the story about Dawn killing Alpharius at the Battle of Pluto didn't exist when this was created. So the idea was this was actually the only time Alpharius was supposed to have died at the hands of another Primarch. Then they wrote the books, and then they came up with the story of Alpharius meeting Dawn at the Battle of Pluto and dying there. So then this piece of lore had to be sort of reimagined in people's minds as being, oh, well, that must be Omegon that's fighting him. When in fact the original writers meant it to be either Alpharius or one of his Astartes pretending to be him. So basically what we have to do is say this piece of lore is probably outdated and needs to be retconned at some point. It's possible that there will be a book out eventually that covers the Great Scouring in more detail and the events here, and we'll get a whole story based around this conflict, and we'll see what really happened, at least as close to what really happened as the writers will be allowed to do with any story related to the Alpha Legion. So there'll always be some element of uncertainty in the answer that's given, even if a book is written about this. They won't just say Omegon was there, he fought Guilliman and he died, or Omegon wasn't there and Guilliman fought somebody else and he killed him, or any other mix of that. Is going to be something along the lines of, well, it could have been Omegon, and you might want to think that it is if you really like to think that, but equally, if you don't want to believe that, there's enough room in the answer that you don't need to believe that as well, and that you can believe that Omegon is still out there fighting the good fight against the Imperium, or with the Imperium, or whatever he is actually trying to do. And it's up to you. That's the kind of the way that the Alpha Legion has always been written, and probably always will be, because that's their purpose. Also, I think it's interesting when you look at this as a piece of outdated lore, the way that not only has Alpharius Omegon's character been developed so much during the Horus Heresy, so has Guilliman's. And we see that Guilliman's character, as written through the Horus Heresy books, is not the same as this Guilliman. In that, I believe that the writers, when they wrote this snippet of Guilliman's backstory, were trying to portray him as a much more powerful individual warrior than he turned out to be in the Horus Heresy books, where he's much more fleshed out. And you've really, reading the Horus Heresy books as a total, Guilliman's not that good as a fighter as you would expect from before you read the Heresy books. And the real emphasis put on him in the Horus Heresy is that he's a great general in terms of a strategist. He's the pure strategist. He's not that good at many other things. He's not very good with people. He's not very good at individual combat. He's okay. Obviously, as a Primarch, he's a combat monster. He can destroy any single Astarte like it's nothing. But compared to the other Primarchs, he's not that special. He's mid-ranking at best when it comes to individual combat. But that actually makes more sense, because in the Horus Heresy books, they've tried to make the characters much more rounded, much more complex, and more believable. And it wouldn't make sense for Guilliman to be perfect at everything, because you just would make 20 Guilliman. Guilliman has been made by the Emperor to be a very high-level strategist, not to be everything in one person. It makes him a better character than some of the other writings outside of the Horus Heresy, which perhaps give the impression of him being too good, which is why he has a kind of a love-hate relationship with 40k fans. I always felt, when I was reading these little articles and stuff about Guilliman and the Ultramarines before the Horus Heresy books came out, that they were just too good. They were too perfect, and that kind of made them boring and inaccessible and unrelatable, and almost makes you dislike them. Whereas when you read them in the Horus Heresy, and you do see they're not particularly good at certain things, and that of course applies to all the Primarchs, then they become more likable, to me at least, and I think to the majority of fans. So I personally view this piece of lore in that context, because it's probably outdated. One day it will probably get completely retconned, and that's okay, because this is the kind of lore that should be retconned, because it was just a placeholder for more fully developed characters and story will come along. So there we go. That is my thoughts on this very controversial incident in the 40k universe's history. Let me know what you think. Do you think that that event actually happened? Do you think the event has been accurately recorded? And do you think that history has been passed down accurately through 10,000 years of the Imperium? Or do you have another view on this? Maybe I've overlooked something. Do you think Guilliman is a combat monster and easily killed Omegon with one strike? Maybe you do. It'd be great to hear from you in the comments. Thanks for watching, and like, subscribe, share, and I will see you next time.